Okay, it's time to move on to the rendering of the lights next, as we know. So in this stage we want to start refining the lights, creating the transitions, the edges and all this nice stuff we see happening on the figure. And of course clean things up a little bit, since we have a pretty smudgy sort of indication for the planes right now. So we're just looking to go over things one by one area by one. It's sort of in preparation for the painting phase as well, where you can't really hop around, nudge things around here and there, because if you say you paint for 3 hours, you paint an hour here, an hour there, an hour on the foot, and maybe you don't really finish any of those areas, then it will be dry by the next session, and any transitions you fail to do in that time, you will have to actually fully repaint. So you will have to lay down all the paint again and then soften things. So you can't really hop around as much. We're sort of trying to get into that habit in here with this drawing stage already, when of course there's no real reason why not to hop around, but it's good to sort of stay focused and learn that habit already at this stage, instead of having to learn it the hard way in the painting phase. I'm just sort of reinforcing a little bit this shadow edge over here. This is so thin, so I don't really mind touching that shadow a little bit in the rendering of the lights as well. It's hardly worthwhile saving basically a black line or dark line just for the shadow stage or dark rendering stage. So yeah, we just want to find the transition. So I think I'm just starting with this shoulder area here. I'll just try to find an angle where I can stay comfortably and not destroy my neck while I'm also not in front of the camera. So, and as I said in the bark video before, we kind of have to decide on what the sort of quality of our rendering is. Are we going for the full sort of dot picked look, where there's no smudges, or say none of the paper texture showing, like in here for example we see some lighter lines showing up as we tone things, and there's cracks in the paper basically due to the paper texture. This is not smooth as an eggshell, for example. It has a little bit of texture. So do we want to really get rid of that texture, or do we want to just make the transitions work as they are? For me, I'm just going to try to make them work as they are, clean things out in terms of any smudges and darker spots and all that stuff, but I'm not gonna take it all the way, let's say, to the really finely dot picked stage. It's just it's very time consuming. You can basically double or triple the amount of time you spend on an area doing that. Here I figured maybe I'll just touch a couple things on the neck here, so it's basically finished after that, since it's a very quick area to work. Just gets a little bit darker here where the hair is casting a little bit of a shadow on there. And this shadow is not very uniform in its value, so let's just pick out some things, soften this edge a little bit. All right, I think it's good, and time to move onwards. So it's important to have your pencil sharp for this stage. Since we do sort of have to touch on that paper texture stuff or the very small details occasionally, then we need to have a tool that is sharp enough to actually reach those areas. The kind of distracting line over there, just kind of pointing us to the wrong direction, where this trapezius is sort of heading. I'm just working this area a little bit so that it doesn't look like the end of the clavicle is just popping out of there too much. I think that's enough. Perhaps let's just get back to this shoulder area a little bit. in the middle here there could be something a little bit lighter going on, so let's just get rid of that. I think the lightness sort of extends a little bit more towards this tip of the shoulder, which has the acromion process. So at this point, if you know your anatomy, you could just sort of go on and refine your drawing without even looking at the model too much. You just know where things are and how you've placed them on the paper, you know, and that could be already enough to create a believable drawing. Of course, if we're students, we don't really want to be too confident about everything being correct at this stage. We just want to keep fixing smaller things. Of course, we don't want to make like very major changes at this stage. Should be that we tackled those in the previous stages if there were any to fix. And there were, of course. We're not perfect. That's normal. Want to soften this transition a little bit. This paper texture is pretty fine on my paper. It's a pretty cheap Fabriano paper. I think it's Fabriano Academico. It's meant for like students basically. I could just find a good roll of it for a good price. So if I want to make, you know, larger drawings, I have paper available, as well as you know, if I want to make transfer drawings for paintings, that would be an option as well. But yeah, if this is your first time drawing the figure, then I recommend you do make the transfer drawing for your project. That will really save you a lot of hassle, and really try to make things nice before you transfer, so then you might end up with a very clean and nice drawing. So I see this darker line over here, which isn't really necessary, so I'm just trying to perhaps soften that out a little bit so it sort of blends a little bit more with the environment. We're not really seeing that line on the reference, so I'm just trying to pick out the darkest moments of that line from there. I can go in and refine those lighter spots again. We can create a softer transition, so there's no like weird dark line sort of defining the arm where the values should be more or less the same, where we lose the edge between these two shadows. Okay, perhaps we can then start pushing the tones a little bit more towards here. Basically, if we did the big four modeling and the plane stage very well, then at this point we shouldn't really have too much work. That said, the tools aren't very refined always. They might leave, you know, very smudgy, sort of a smudgy kind of finish, so we want to clean it up a little bit. So I'm thinking maybe we need to add a little bit of tone over here. I'm barely touching the paper here, it's just leaving the very faintest of tones. I think I might actually lock and load the 4H lead in this pencil holder of mine, or the lead holder of mine, just so this kind of toning gets a bit easier, because with that it's hard to even make a mark like I just did, which is, you know, just way too dark with a light touch. With a light touch I still left it too dark of a mark. And I feel like this turning tone is sort of extending a little bit too much in here, so I'm just gonna first soften the edge, see what happens. It's gonna lighten it a little bit. It's already better, and then we can just perhaps adjust the edge just slightly with a little bit of tone. Possibly need to pick out a little bit more with this. And perhaps we can just soften the edge between the line of the arm. sort of create it into a tone rather than have it be a line. It's a bit of a back and forth, but the end result should be something nice to look at. I don't really enjoy having this line here too much, but we can actually probably also work it a little bit on the other side, so we can darken on the other side to also reduce the line-like quality we're having. So if we soften the edges of that line, it stops being a line and starts being a tone rather. Just this darker tone I do see happening on here because again it's a place where the arm is sort of close to the body. It starts creating this more shadowy or half-tony area, or half shadow, I don't know. Anyways, things tend to get darker. We see that on the image. That's sort of the tone on the side here is basically just creating a little bit of a line. There's no like outline on the arm. That's not something that really happens. It's the tone underneath that defines the arm. So perhaps we didn't really need it as dark as we did already on here. And we're sort of moving down along the arm. I guess I'm sort of happy with this shoulder and arm area. I just want to perhaps refine the outline of the arm here a little bit. It's looking a little bit fuzzy. Just cleaning that up creates already a little bit of a more refined finish. So I was talking about this in the ARC demo a little bit already, but where things sort of overlap and one thing goes behind another. In this case, the contour of the breast sort of goes behind the arm here. In this case, we can soften that edge on the one that, no, sorry, we can soften the sort of line that is going behind the other thing a little bit, so it recedes a little bit in space. So this is something we can use to help the illusion of depth as well. It's not something we can use very often in drawing perhaps, but more so in painting, especially still lifes where there's a bunch of things sort of intentionally also layered and overlapping. So but there's basically any place where we find something that goes behind another thing, we could soften this edge a little bit, this edge, the thigh behind the hand we can soften a little bit, this shin going behind the other one we can soften a little bit. Well, we don't really see this edge very well, but we could soften this forearm going behind the torso there. All this kind of stuff. This thigh going behind the other. So there are some parts where we can utilize this. And mentioning that, of course, then we can use that a little bit to our advantage. We don't want to make it maybe super obvious unless we like to have things very sort of soft. It might just kind of look a little bit weird when drawing, but we can do the slightest amount of that softening. And softening happens by creating a transition. So basically you don't want to have a line just entering the contour. You could slightly, pick out that line at the very end and some of the tones next to it. So there's a little bit of a gradation towards a lighter tone when it hits the body. Very subtle thing, and absolutely not necessary for the refinement of this drawing, but that's something we can do. And I think it's a good thing to learn at this point as well. We're not really focused on edges yet, but if I can tell you about some concept, I will, and perhaps it will leave a slight mark somewhere in your brain, and then when we face it and want to apply it, then perhaps you will recall that information a little bit better. It's not an entirely fresh concept. So I want to finish this area next. So perhaps we can just carry on this tone a little bit. This is the sort of halftone created by the scapula. We have a darker tone here. And we're not afraid to darken this this side here because it's kind of goes with the big 4 modeling. And then we can just lighten things up a little bit over here. But these are some pretty subtle tone shifts, so we want to keep them subtle. We don't want to overemphasize it too much. Also in here I keep seeing a shadow of the line I drew earlier, so just trying to scrub that out because I took the arm a little bit too far initially, and now it has created a little bit of an impression of a line over there, so that's slightly annoying, but we can just ignore that. Can't really do anything about it. And this is why I tell you to be careful with your paper. You don't want to create ghostly lines where they don't have to be, so, or rather where they shouldn't be. Again, going a little bit too dark on this tone, so I'll just pick out some things a little bit. Currently it's looking more like a smudge rather than a half tone, so let's just lighten it overall a little bit so it's more in line with that. These tones are so subtle, it's just kind of crazy. The slightest amount of value just makes it too much. I'll just sharpen my 2H. For this stuff we really want that needle sharp tone basically, or sorry, needle sharp pencil to be able to tackle small things like this where there's just small lines on there. It's just leaving too dark a tone for my taste right now. So you usually want to wipe off the lead after you sharpen. You can just, well, I've been using this one. It's really intended for this. You can just dip your pencil in it and wipe it off, but it's pretty saturated already for me, so I'll just, you know, wipe it a little bit on the kneaded eraser. That way there's no, you know, extra dust causing things to darken up after sharpening here. I'm just trying to squint here, seeing where we can take this. Just figured maybe we can darken this top part a little bit so we have a little bit more room to navigate with these tones. I don't mind a little bit of hatching showing the final drawing, but I don't want too much of it either, so it's a bit of a stylistic choice as well. At school we wouldn't really use hatching at all as something, you know, as a visible end result, let's say. We did this technique where I'm just toning things in is hatching, but hatching can also be the sort of term for the end result of the shading as well, if you have very distinct lines pulled across, like in ink drawings, for example. So it could just refer to that as a result as well. So perhaps I'm just giving this area a little bit more care. Now I'm not moving too fast because this is sort of the focal area and I want this really to, you know, look really nice. More nice than, say, you know, the knee over here or the feet or something like this. I'm more interested in this area to look refined. If we sort of go from very refined and give it a bit of a gradation, it will also look like a nice drawing, sort of planned one where, you know, goes from super finished to a little bit sketchier, let's say, Could even leave the feet like this if we just clean out the tones a little bit instead of working the transitions. That might be a nice way to finish a drawing as well. But yeah, our goal is now to learn rendering, so let's just render everything. Whenever you see something very distracting, then just get rid of it. There was a light line underneath the dark hair there, which is not supposed to be there. So, and I noticed maybe there's a little bit of a turning issue here. We'll just have to darken the edge a little bit more. Yeah, I think it's working better. Okay, the subtlety of these tones is getting to the point where probably like the camera, I'm imagining the camera is having a hard time picking this up, so maybe let's move on. See something weird happening over here. Let's just pick that out, probably from the time where we toned the hair. We don't actually mind having a little bit of a softer edge over here. We can use it to our advantage as we discussed earlier, softening things a little bit. We don't really mind having this bit of softness as long as this sort of form here is working. So maybe I won't carry that line out to the very end. Just a little bit of a stylistic choice there, or let's say it's an easy way to create you know, another level of refinement with a limiting medium like graphite here. We don't have too much to play with, so. All right, let's maybe tackle the shadow edge a little bit here. Just want to soften it slightly, but this shadow is quite sharp and doesn't really extend out much. There's this extra tone over here that we don't really like, so let's get rid of these two squigglies here and should clean things up a little bit already. Very nice. Basically this area just to me doesn't have almost any tone. Maybe we can push this form a little bit further down, but the goal is to sort of fade it into paper white just at the very end here. Also we need maybe just some softness for this area here as well. We see that's very sharp on the image, but we don't really like that too much. So you see me making these decisions that aren't really guided maybe by the image all the time. So this is just stuff that will come to you as you start understanding why we do things. And I think that one goal for this course is to have you understand these things, you know, internalize the form modeling is probably the main thing that will already push you leaps and bounds ahead of others who are, you know, trying to do realism on their own. The form is pretty much number one. You hear the saying that value is king, and value is king because it describes all of this form, and after that you could work on edges. I think I'm sort of taking it for granted that you're working on drawing all the time anyways, but so you want to of course be able to put things down in proportion. That's kind of a very, very fundamental thing to start working on. It's not easy to master by any means, but it's relatively quick. It's just a thing we practice to get better at, so you will get better at it eventually. Well, you will get better at it all the time, but eventually you will be very good at it, so if you just keep practicing. So I'm just trying to work a little bit on these transitions of the focal area here. So perhaps we can maybe darken this edge a little bit more. Rather, maybe we can first lighten the outline a little bit. We don't really want to have this dark outline where the light is hitting. It's not really feeling like it's serving the illusion here. We want to create a magic trick where the viewer thinks this drawing is super realistic. And if it's a light part of the form ending in a dark outline, it can look nice when you're stylizing things, but it's not maybe something that we want to strive for when we're creating a realistic rendition of a drawing. So already this shoulder looks a lot better with just, giving the outline a pass. So maybe I'll just clean it up a little bit as well. Sharpen it slightly. When you work on the outline, of course, then you have to check that you're still operating within the drawing, Check your reference. Are you making too great of a change? Millimeter is a huge amount in a drawing of this scale, so keep that in mind. Perhaps I went a little bit too dark with the turning tone, considering the light is coming from the right and hitting this shoulder pretty nicely, so just push that back a little bit. We want to have tone there, but also we don't want to push it too far left into the light. Now just create a little transition over here, and perhaps then we can move towards this area of the form. So again, maybe we can darken a little bit over here. This is the bottom of the scapula, sort of the right bottom facing plane. It's facing downwards, so perhaps we can be a little bit more bold and darken this slightly. We imagine the light is coming from somewhere above, and sort of it's fine to darken this a little bit more when that's the case. We don't want to go too dark though, but darkening it slightly also gives us a little bit of leeway with the other colors, but perhaps I maybe darkened it a little bit too much, just sort of popping out of there a little bit much as it stands. So, but I feel like we can keep this a little bit darker than that other side. So let's work the transition, see how it looks. We can still lighten it up a little bit if we want to, but if we just leave it as a shape, it's always going to look a little bit weird. So just work a little bit of tone on here as it's turning. Just softening this, sort of finding the shape for that as well. So working this area, I think we need to push down this the shoulder a little bit, not much, but we can just slightly lower it. Maybe it looks a little bit more relaxed, whereas it was a little too tilted here to be sort of kind of relaxed pose. It's actually, we see the clavicle sort of popping out of there a little bit earlier, so let's just make sure we get that in there. And here's where you should be using your mouse stick. I think there's a saying about Da Vinci and a mole stick where he was a bit ashamed to use it in his older days, but I think it's better to create nice artwork and swallow your pride using the mole stick rather than let ego make your artwork lower quality. Well, I'm not saying Da Vinci made bad artwork, that's probably not the case. But if you have a shaky hand, like maybe I do a little bit, at least in this weird position, I'm sort of having to work from the side on this, because if I was right up front, you would see my back mostly. Not a great viewpoint for a student, I think. So, but I think this is a decent compromise. Alright, I think this is a point where I take a small break. Also, I think I'll switch the 2H LED into the 4H LED. Alright, time to continue. So we've looked at these areas, I guess, over here, as well as the next. So what I didn't mention yet is it's a good idea to sort of try to work from top to bottom, usually in this dry media like graphite and charcoal. Graphite less, so it doesn't tend to, you know, trickle down. But if we learn this way, then once we head into charcoal, the charcoal might move, you know, if you do something like this. Oops, I banged my you know, whatever knee on the easel or whatever, and it might just trickle down charcoal. And if you start somewhere around here, the charcoal might trickle down and, you know, affect a bit of your rendering down here eventually. Maybe not much, but incrementally, if that tends to happen to you, then you know, you might have to retouch the areas you already once worked, as opposed to when you start from the top and work your way down, then, you know, the refined areas are above and tends to get less charcoal on them. On the graphite, not as important, as I said, doesn't happen with graphite. We can bang this drawing as much as we want and nothing's coming off, but also in terms of, you know, resting your hand and this way, you know, you might touch things below accidentally. That sort of applies to graphite more. Okay, there's not much happening in this area. Let's just make the form turn a little bit better. When in doubt, we can always turn the form a little bit more. Can also, I guess, soften that edge a little bit as well. It's going behind the hair there, so it's looking a bit smoother, but now it's a little bit too dark in this area, which we want to sort of retain a bit of the lightness. So now coming back after a break, I noticed there's these kind of weird looking lines going next to the hair. Probably just slight mistakes with the pencil when I was working the hair. We don't mind small, you know, inconsistencies of the outline of the hair, which will simply soften it up a little bit. But we don't want extremely sharp lines going next to it. It's not looking very natural. One might think it's all right because there's, you know, bound to be individual strands of hair, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, you know, if our finishing resolution, let's say, for this drawing, I guess that's a decent, you know, way to say it, but if it's of the level that we don't really want to put too much detail in the hands because it just gets, you know, microscopic, or, you know, we're not going to work on the portrait too much because, you know, it's so small, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to start putting in details like individual hair strands when we're ignoring most of the details of the hand, for example, which is a larger kind of thing. So we have to keep that in mind as well. I realize there's a lot of things to keep in mind, so probably your mind is quite full by now. I'm just softening the edge of this hair a little bit, kind of also working the darks here. I guess we could just address this at that point, but since we're rendering this area, we might as well tackle this edge that is sort of adjacent to it. Usually when we work an area, we want to work the transitions surrounding that area also, not just leave something entirely untouched on one side of it. Also will make this whole thing seem a little bit more finished when we are done with this area. All right, now this hair edge is a little bit softer. We did this by simply adding a little bit of tone on this edge, very lightly. It's now extending a little bit towards the right, this hair mass, but now it's not like a razor sharp shape, even though it is very, you know, shapy, but we want to take control of these things by working the edges. So yeah, I guess finally we will work this area on this side of the torso. After that, we are pretty much done from up here. So just moving downwards. All right, let me just refine this edge. Again, this is a place where perhaps we can sort of sharpen the edge of the torso a little bit above. And perhaps leave this edge of the forearm going behind the torso more or less alone, or soften it on this end so it doesn't really feel like it's sharper than the thing in front of it. Basically the sharpest thing here should be this mass of hair, which is a bit of an exception of course, but we could sort of add a little bit of firmness to the tone over there. Since we just softened this part, firming up this edge to a sharper side of things can also give a bit of edge variety, which we also are, of course, enjoyers of. I personally am an edge variety enjoyer. Okay, getting a bit distracted with that, so let's just return to this form over here. Let's turn the forearm a little bit. So immediately feeling a bit more at home with this 4H pencil. As I said in probably the materials video, it's a bit like drawing with a rock. It doesn't seem to be getting dull on me at any point. It's just such a hard lead at this point already, but it is good for subtle stuff, I want to say. So let's just work on the niceties here. Again, keeping in mind we want to just keep moving forward. As I said, in school we might use an entire 3-hour session for an area like this when one is a beginner and sort of looking to really push it to the, the utmost level of finish we can achieve with the graphite. So I guess what I'm giving you here is sort of a tutorial kind of thing where we learn how to use these materials, what you can do with these. But I'm also trying to aim for a finish that would be perhaps, realistic for you to achieve at home. I think, pushing it to the absolute limit really requires a teacher of some kind to just push a little bit further. You might call this, finished, and then your teacher comes in and tells you to fix things, and you're like, I didn't even see those things, and that's how your eye develops. So it does require a bit of back and forth. There's also an area where, maybe your friends and relatives can't really help you out too much anymore, where your eye is more developed than theirs. Of course, since you've been doing these exercises and then you show them this and they're like, wow, that's super nice and finished. I love how you rendered this, arm or whatever. And maybe your teacher might have something different to say. Obviously giving you a compliment first, but then telling you to fix things. That's how it goes. So this elbow area is a little bit too light for my taste right now, so let's just bring it down a little bit by hatching. It doesn't need to be stark paper white over here. It's a bit weird to have something paper white when it's surrounded by darkness. Also, I just darkened everything around here, so we don't really need to, we really need to reassess the sort of contrast that we're having between these areas. So if we darken something, the contrast will increase, and suddenly the light area I created before is too light, and as such we brought it down just a little bit, so it's not paper white anymore. Again, perhaps here a little too dark on the outline, also a little bit on the thicker side. I'll just try to thin out the outline a little bit in order to also lighten it slightly, or let's say not lighten it, but create a lighter appearance for it. If you have something that is thick and dark and something that is thin and dark, the thick and dark thing will appear darker. So even though I didn't really exactly lighten the value perhaps of this outline, it started appearing a little bit lighter because I thinned it out a little bit. Now, since the outline has some of these darker dots from the previous passes, I will just sort of refine those a little bit. If you want a really clean outline, super sharp, super uniform part of the form, you really need to get into this dot picking. And it can take a lot of time. Dot picking meaning, you know, picking out darker things with the eraser and picking out lighter things with the pencil. Usually there's sort of small dots or smudges that you're sort of coloring in or taking away. More often than not, you're doing both, you know, simultaneously to an area. So one can imagine it's a sort of back and forth dance, cleaning things up like that. I try not to go too much into that because once I push an area to that sort of finish, then it starts sort of, I guess, shining above the others in its level of finish. So everything else starts to feel rough again, even if I render it. So I'm trying to avoid doing it too much where it's not necessary. If an area feels a little bit too rough, then I will sort of give it a mild pass of dot picking, like maybe I will do over here. Keeping in mind, of course, that we're also darkening things while we're coloring things in, and lightening things if we're picking things out. So I just want to clean this up enough so that we can read the subtle transitions. That's the goal, really. And sometimes there's so much, you know, graininess to the area that you can't really read these subtle things. So sort of serves a purpose as well, this cleaning up of the image. So in a way, sort of the limit of your rendering comes from the amount you dot pick. If you do none, then there's only so much subtlety you can do at this scale. Of course, if you're working, you know, twice this size perhaps in Graphite, then you don't need to probably dot pick at all. It might be that you're just fine hatching things. I'm just coloring in the darker spots that are right in the area that defines the arm. There's a weird kind of thing happening where it's feeling like there's light things going on, and it seems like there's two lines going in places. So just trying to clean it out so there's no weird optical things going on. And this does mean I have to retouch a little bit of this upper arm area. Also, when you're really zoomed into these small, you know, paper texture details, basically it helps to squint a little bit and see if the entire thing is working a little bit better. It can be hard to sort of get back to the big picture once you've been doing this for a moment. Here I think this edge has sort of creeped down a little bit on us, so let's just push it slightly upwards. Maybe we're softening things at the same time. We want things to be soft over here, so we don't mind having a transition there. But this is also a lesson in how, when you nudge things around like this, with this, you know, going back and forth, the shapes might change, the position of things might change a little bit. So just keep that in mind. Try to reassess things every now and then. So maybe I'm pushing this area a little bit in terms of the dot picking, because it's still a part of this sort of visual focal area. I want this back to feel soft, so just cleaning it up, perhaps a little bit more than what I will be doing lower in the picture. Okay, so perhaps we want to lighten this a little bit more. Want to sort of have this crease more visible in here. Want it to be subtle, but subtle and soft, but also visible. So it's not, it's not just something we ignore either, even if we sort of play it down a little bit. On the image there, it seems a little bit soft on both sides, but when we're pondering, how do we soften this thing so it looks like a form, usually the answer is to soften it towards the crest of light, basically. And also, of course, this is a sort of pinched area. The bottom is sort of defining the pinch, the crease, and the top area is just part of the torso form, so that's an easy way to go about it. Right, I think that's plenty of attention for that area. I think this needs to be a bit darker over here. I'm just kind of moving right along, ensuring the transition to that area we did nicely is kind of nice as well. So right, I think that area is working pretty nicely. Here I'm seeing a light line sort of in between here. It doesn't really stand too well with us, so let's just grab that out of there. As always, it tends to sort of destroy a little bit of the turning of the form. Since we know this this left side is the darker area of the form, and having a light line going over here sort of destroys that illusion. It sort of destroys the meaning of these values over here. So I'm kind of second guessing my placement of this stuff over here. I'm looking at the image and I feel like the glute sort of needs to end a little bit sooner. So perhaps something more like this. Just get rid of this distracting information over here and see where we end up with. Perhaps that also means we need to lift up this crease a little bit. Let's just pick up a pencil that actually leaves a mark. That's the other side of the 4H pencil. It's also harder to create any sort of tone. So yeah, it's not too late to fix things. Usually it's never too late. So especially in areas like this where we've toned things in already, it doesn't really matter if we have some ghostier marks in there. They'll just get, covered by the graphite tone regardless. Perhaps this sort of roundness of the form can also be pushed downwards a little bit. Working more with this form. All right, let's just make these small adjustments. I think this overall is a little too round. Just push it in a little bit. I'm going for these quite subtle changes, so don't worry about it. You don't have to go for changes like this unless they're necessary, I'm just being a little bit picky right now. And perhaps we can further along carve in a little bit from here. I want it to feel more anatomically accurate than what I had, so and the nice thing is we sort of worked the outline already on this area now, so we don't have to worry about it too much. Yeah, I think it's way more in proportion now. Perhaps this is still a little bit too tilted, so giving off a sense that it's a little bit too round perhaps. But yeah, that's probably modeling rather than drawing error, so just push that a little bit over there. All right, let's get back to the rendering itself. When I'm using multiple pencils, just make sure you have the right one so you don't make any silly mistakes. All right, let's leave this area alone a little bit. Let's not render it immediately after we made some changes, so perhaps let's get back into this elbow area. First thing is I'll just clean it up a little bit. It's looking a little bit messy here with the paper texture things showing. All right, I made this shadow perhaps a little bit on the darker side now that we dot pick things, but I don't really mind that. This area is sort of slanted this way, as you can see. It's on the shadow side. It's facing away from the reflected light coming from the ground. I'm assuming there's not much reflected light coming from upwards. Perhaps there's a wall that she's facing, might be something coming from there, but this situation we sort of see is she's standing obviously on a surface that gives reflected light, and the light source is behind her. There's only one light source. So we can sort of believably make this a little bit darker if we want to. Meanwhile, we can also darken things over here if we would like to. But yeah, maybe there's some really dark dots that I can still pick out of there, but that should sort of even out the value perhaps. So this rendering stuff is pretty tiring for your eyes. Once you start feeling like, you know, shapes are just jumping around and you can't really focus in anymore. I mean, you're literally like 20 to 30 centimeters away from the paper, looking into very small details. Then obviously you should take breaks whenever you feel like, and rather more often than less often. Also step back and check your work from a distance. That's gonna help you spot any mistakes also while you're rendering them, because the changes are very gradual. When you step back and create a new perspective, you can see it with a sort of fresh eye and tell if you're going in the right or wrong direction. Whenever you come back to your project after a break, you should really take a while when you're still further away from your drawing board and then assess what's going on before you come back and zoom in. Okay, there's this white line going in the middle. Probably works as a reflected light or highlight kind of thing if we want to keep it there, but it's not really what we're seeing, so let's just tone it down a little bit. I think it's not very stylish to have a huge amount of these kind of specular highlights on the figure. It sort of starts looking like they're very sweaty or something. But you know, here and there, definitely they can add to the image. Say probably gonna keep this one over here. Probably gonna keep the one on the heel down here. They sort of add a bit of dimension to the picture, I would say. All right, let's have a break. Okay, let's keep going. So we took a break and I feel like the areas we worked on previously are more or less alright. Sort of stopped mid-session here on the elbow area because I felt like my eyes were getting a bit too tired to assess things properly, so probably I need to switch pencils here when I'm working stuff that is this dark, so I'm going back to the HB. Again, with the 4H I could probably like slowly darken things, sure, but why do that that way when it's, you know, when it's possible to do it very much quicker with the HB, so perhaps this is the more efficient approach. So while this process is also, it's meant to teach you. It's meant to teach you, and as such it's a bit of a, you know, rigid, structured process. But also it's important to keep in mind it's also about efficiency in that process, so I want to keep that in mind. So you notice me hopping around a little bit in these areas, it's somewhat intentional. So while I'm working, I'll, you know, maybe jump between different sections of the area I will be rendering in any case very soon. So while I'm staring at this, I sort of get used to looking at it. When things start to feel a bit muddled, I might move to another area, work it for a while, then I go back and I notice the mistakes easier again. So you can be a bit strategic like this as well. You don't have to, you know, take long breaks every 10 minutes or so. Once your eye gets a little bit tired, you can just keep working another area. That's something we can do at least with graphite and charcoal as well. These dry media don't really change on us if we take too long of a break or something like that. Now, when we work daily in school, we use dryers in the paint, which is a bit of a necessity when we're painting in passes. Layers need to be dry so we can apply more paint on top, and those dryers do have their, you know, negative sides to them as well. One being, for example, if you work in the morning on your project and you don't quite finish the area, you then go paint the figure, and then the area might be already quite tacky, you know, sticky and really not blendable. So stuff like that can happen if you jump around too much with when you're painting. Sometimes you can get away with it, but it's just a risk you have to be willing to take then. Right, the shape of this halftone sort of got lost a little bit there. I think it extends a little bit further down here. Again, checking my pencil so I don't confuse things before I go into the light. I don't want to put HB stuff on the highest of lights because it's probably just going to be very dark compared to what I was looking for. So looking at this, just to mention the forearm area around here, it's made up of two bones that are, you know, sitting. There's the fibula that we already, the ulna that we're we've been talking about, ending in the elbow, and here's the other end. We're putting in it's an anatomical landmark, and then there's the radius that sort of we can see going behind the ulna in here. It's this supinating, pronating motion that happens there. But yeah, these two bones create this kind of flatter, not as rounded form for this area of the forearm. So this all just leading to me toning this area of the forearm a little bit darker to describe that flatness. There's a little bit of roundness, but it's approaching a sort of box-like shape, let's say. So if we can, simplify this as a cylinder, this we could simplify as a sort of rectangular, boxy shape, maybe. Of course, the edges are gonna be round as well, but just a concept you can keep in mind, perhaps. And now that I darken things, maybe this highlight in the center is being a bit too bright. We want it to be visible, but we want to also lose it in places. Perhaps it's a variety kind of thing. And also, if you look at the model, it's not like strikingly obvious everywhere. You can't exactly draw an outline around all of the highlight if you were to look at the image. It's very soft in places. Perhaps here it's the most obvious and less so in the lower parts of it. So I'm just trying to soften it out a little bit, perhaps play down the brightness of the light here also a little bit, now that we darkened the entire forearm a little bit. I think it's working pretty nicely now. Perhaps we play down this light on the hand a little bit as well. Just looking to lighten the nails ever so slightly, but it's kind of hard to do these adjustments without going overboard. When you're removing stuff in graphite, it tends to be a bit harder to remove things very accurately. Tends to be that we have to first remove and then we have to add a little bit more to get the final result. So perhaps we can clean up these hands a little bit. Well, these fingers perhaps. Really are just kind of carving small bits of information out of here. Not really even sure if we have the resolution for this fingernail stuff. I'm trying to sort of, in a very small way, indicate. Probably not, but should probably just refine this whole value a little bit more before we touch that stuff anyway. So let's just do that. Yeah, probably we're just gonna leave this stuff alone. I don't think adding a fingernail in there is gonna like make or break the drawing really. Probably just make it look a little bit more busy if anything. So. Let's switch the pencil. I'm just allowing myself to sort of slightly indicate this existence of another finger in here. As we see in the image, we don't want to make it obvious again, but to keep things soft, and perhaps this line that I created here now sort of is a bit sharp. All right. Now just clean things off a little bit. I won't work the hand any more than this. I think the main thing is it's looking like a hand in proportion. Nothing like super weird about it. Perhaps it's a little bit simple. If we really want to push it slightly, we could add some semblance of a knuckle in the outline over here, but it's just very subtle. But yeah, I don't think that's gonna really make a difference here. Perhaps cleaning the outline will make a difference, so let's just do that. Started picking out these small things that were annoying me. All right. It's really destroying my neck, this stuff, you know. It's hard to stay in posture. Also, I'm trying not to move the drawing around. You could lift yours up and down a little bit when you're working, so easier, but for filming reasons, I'm trying not to adjust things too much because it can be a bit of a hassle. Also, the more I move it, the more I have to sort of adjust for that in post-processing, so it's more editing for me. Already spent way too long doing that anyway. Okay, let's pick the next area. Perhaps this region of the lower back here could be before we transition into the glutes. There's not a terrible amount of information over here, but let's just make the transitions work. Went a bit dark on there. As I said, it's a bit of a back and forth thing. I notice it's quite light over here as well, so I just pulled it a smidge back towards a lighter average value, and perhaps now we can just fade it into the paper over here. Push the tone a little bit back. And maybe this tone actually here is reaching too high, so it's giving... It was sort of feeling like this glute sort of ends up somewhere up here because the side plane of it was sort of carrying on. So now we feel like it's kind of turning that way as well. Let's just take care of the transition here. I'm just cleaning out small darker smudges that I feel like are sort of interfering with the transitions. Just ever so slightly tone this stuff over here. This tone is a little bit too dark, so it's giving off a slightly too steep of a turn. But yeah, perhaps I'm sort of actually turning into this glute area as opposed to this area now, so let me just, that's where I'm heading sort of naturally, so I'm just gonna work in that way since that's where I'm, I guess, heading towards, sort of working from up to down, I guess. Then we can pick another area and go up to down here as well. This all sort of melts together. I feel it's natural to tackle the transitions there. So squinting, it's starting to make a bit more sense now. Just sort of trying to approach this in a pretty clean manner. So I'm just trying to clean some smudges out of here so they don't distract me. If I look at an area and I feel like it's smudgy, you know, it's not like a nice clean tone, then I really can't help but I just have to, you know, work at it a little bit so it's a bit nicer. So removing the smudges from this area, I guess, helps with the overall impression a little bit as well, so I can just sort of focus better. If I see smudges over here, this starts to feel a bit dirty as well. So I think it's getting close to the realm of being complete, I guess, this glue transition area. Alright, while I'm here, I'll just work the edge a little bit on this shadow over here. I'm picking some darker spots out so we can have a softer edge. You can see on the reference we get this cast shadow that is sharper and then gradually softens as the shadow is further away from the object that's casting it, which is the hair. And we can see it sort of becoming very soft over here, and that's the part we call penumbra. So we want to describe the penumbra as well over here, not just sort of soften for softening's sake, but we want to just have it feel like the shadow has that sort of penumbra to it. So as I said in the variation stage, we wanted to create a little bit of softness there already, but we're not like rendering it because rendering is part of this stage. But since we had it soft already, we don't have to do the entire transition. And at this stage we want to work pretty, you know, in subtle ways and slower ways. So bigger changes perhaps would be, you know, slower to make at this stage. It's better to sort of try to take it into account at an earlier stage already. So yeah, I think it's starting to sort of feel like a cast shadow. Now, since we softened this quite a bit, we can look for a bit of gradual softening over here as well. The penumbra is over here as well, but it's a little bit less soft. Somewhere around here it starts to really firm up as it turns a little bit slanted to the right. I feel like it turns into this very firm edge over here. Well, it could be described as a sharp edge as well, but maybe we want to leave it a little bit less sharp. Alright, I think that shadow edge is worked out enough. I guess this hair softening on this edge is kind of part of the dark, so let's just leave it at that. Or perhaps during this area we will touch up the hair on that side. So we'll work the inside of the darker areas more in the shadows, but the transitions we can of course work a little bit during this stage already. So when we're painting and doing the second painting where we're basically rendering in paint, that's when we need to put in the bedbug lines in paint if we wish to start modeling from there on. It needs to be wet paint, otherwise it's not going to blend, of course. So in that spirit, we're definitely allowed to touch the shadows or the darks a little bit should we need to in this state. Again, after working there a little bit, I noticed some things to pick out. I think there was a little bit of a darker tone there distracting the modeling a little bit, so just going back and touching it up a little bit. I don't mind keeping the edge a little bit unclear there like that. It's just a little sort of atmospheric thing you can get in your drawings as well. So what I'm doing here right now is I'm just trying to look for things that are light in the places that they shouldn't be, so that I can get the form to read a little bit better. This isn't an entirely dark area, of course. And I do see these darker things in here as well that we want to probably get rid of as we start approaching the lower sections. So it's kind of just a given that larger, softer transitions require a little bit more attention when rendering, as opposed to smaller, cruder transitions. You know, you can't make this very soft transition without giving it attention, as opposed to, you know, something like a pretty rough planar change. You can sort of get away with a little bit less rendering. Okay, perhaps we start looking at this area then. I think this entire area is a little bit darker than the paper white, so let's just give it a slight once over. You know, it makes sense if this these glutes are sort of facing the light source. Of course, the back is sort of rounding out and turning more vertical. Less of the light is hitting it, so it's going to be slightly darker. These things are very, very small, subtle things, but they can make a difference. Subtle tends to be the place where we operate with this kind of stuff. It's kind of one of the advantages of graphite. You can push it to a pretty nice extreme with this stuff. So, as I mentioned with the Park project, there's, you know, you can go too far as well with this stuff, you know, where the dot picking, you know, the cleaning out the tones can sort of become a distraction from the actual process. I think it's only necessary to do that to the point where you can start reading the tones and the subtle forms, the subtle shifts of tone. But, you know, once you start getting to the place where the grain of the paper is distracting you from the image, once you dot pick it to that level, you know, it's just not necessary. It's just a waste of time. It is impressive, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessary. You know, people saw works in the school where, you know, they went to that place, but they took a full year to complete, so I wonder whose money is going into that tuition. I don't think anyone has the time to spend that much on a single drawing. That's still just, you know, a student work, of course, but perhaps some people work that way as artists, you know, where they spend a full year on a drawing or many months on a drawing, and that's fine, you know. It's a choice, and probably they find a way to make it work out. But as a student, I don't think it's very efficient to work on a project for a full year or more, sometimes more. Of course, you know, if there's limitations, something that prevents you from moving quickly, obviously it's fine, just take your time. My point more like was that if you have the choice, perhaps you should just move on instead of endlessly refining the project. Is, you know, this rendering part can be kind of fun. It's like you already did the hard work and now you get to really finish it nicely. It's like a reward at the end. So I guess kind of if you're extending this out too much, it's like you're just sort of reaping the rewards constantly and trying not to get to the next phase where you have to put in a lot of work again. Sort of like procrastination in a way, except you get a nice drawing at the end, but I think it's a bit diminishing in the returns. And I'm sorry for rambling. I should just focus on the drawing, I think. Here's what I'm saying with the dot picking again. I see some stuff happening in the previous areas, and the more I work on those areas, the more refined they become, and the more I see mistakes, or rather inconsistencies, not mistakes. Let's take another break. It's going well.